All right, everyone. Welcome back to this episode of Dialogue, Not Division. In this sixth episode, we will be covering student debt and wind power. So moving right along, I wanted to start with the current issue that I wanted to talk about. So I was watching an interesting video that was talking about whether or not President Biden had the authority to clear all student or federal student debt, I should say, under his executive authority. And the answer by this scholar that was in this video was a resounding yes. And what was interesting is the person was saying, well, if he can do it within his authority, he should do it. Why is he only going for X amount of money? And one of the interesting comments I saw on this YouTube video is it was something along the lines of, imagine being able to wave your hand and make people's lives better and being so cold-hearted that you won't. Now, of course, I believe that there are almost always two sides to every issue, so I wanted to take a moment here and just to really dig deep, do some research about student loans, about forgiveness and how this policies might affect, and see if some of the common things that are being proposed would actually have an effect or what effect they would have. So one of the big things you're seeing trending on Twitter is the student loan forgiveness. A lot of the Democrats are pushing for $50K in federal student loan forgiveness per person's up to $50K. One thing that you will notice is that President Biden, for the most part, has only discussed $10,000 in student loan forgiveness. So that was another big criticism of that video is, why is he only doing $10,000? Why is he barely doing this at all? He should be doing more. So let's go ahead and just take a quick dive into this issue and really see what I think about it, or some of the facts on either side, and get moving in here. Starting with the issue, I just want to cover some of the main talking points that you hear when you hear about people talking about student loan forgiveness versus not. So of course, one of the big things you hear is that student loans are unfair or predatory. So we'll be looking at that. We hear a lot about the student loans or the current state of it, how it's negatively affecting the economy, and we'll look at that as well. I also saw the statistic, it was from a few years back, that student loans are the second biggest U.S. debt, right behind, I believe it was mortgages, and that's for your average family. And a big thing that you see a lot is, yeah, maybe your grandparents could have made it through college without student loan debt, but that's no longer possible, according to them. And we'll take a look at why that is. And then, of course, on the other side, you have the talking points of why are we giving this handout to people, college grads who have the largest earning potential, things like you signed up for the loan, so now it's your turn to pay it back. And the other main argument is you're taking money from those with the lesser earning potential to pay for those college degrees of the additional. So getting into some of those talking points, or before I should say we get into those, is I'd really like to just take a look at the issue. So one of the things I wanted to show here is this is the historical total national student loan debt balance. So you'll see here it starts in 2003. You might not be able to see, but this chart does end all the way in 2021. You'll see here as it goes all the way up to $1.7 trillion. So yes, that is quite a lot of money in national student loans. And so looking at that number, you're like, wow, that's a lot of money that people are taking out. Another factor or another stat I saw thrown around on some of the sites that were really advocating for this is that it's been growing 6 times faster than the economy. One caveat I did want to say here in this is really what the video I was doing and a lot of what I'm referring to was talking about federal student loans. The stat I found for that, or the latest stat, was about 1.57 trillion. Of that 1.7 was federal student loans. The vast majority of these are federal student loans. And the proposal here was, again, let's just wave our hand and make that go away. With that, So talking a little bit about some of the averages, so 45.3 million student borrowers are in debt by an average of $30,691 each is the stat I found. And then there are 42.9 million Americans with federal student loan debt. Each owe about $36,510 for their federal loan. So that's quite a bit of money. And that's where I think you're seeing some of that 50,000 figure coming in is I think a lot of the Democrats are proposing to pay off the average debt here, or a little bit above the average. One other stat you see is 2.5 million borrowers owe on average about $57,083 each private loans. So that's quite a bit more on average when it comes to private loans. So that's the problem here. So what's the big deal? So a lot of people have debt. There's a lot of other debts that you can see. Of course, many of you may have credit card debt. Oftentimes that feels predatory. That feels very harsh. So what's the difference here? What's the default rates? What's going on? One of the big arguments here is that federal student loans, or student loans in general, are very hard to pay off. They put undue hardship on people. One of the biggest talking points you see is that you can't normally, under bankruptcy laws, you can't normally get exempted from those student loans. So those that are in really difficult situations can't even get those removed. What we are seeing here is some of the stats I found on the website. These websites are that 25% of borrowers default on their loan within the first 5 years of repayment. So right within that first 5 years, you're talking about that. Moving on, in 2017, the default rate, or the average default rate, was 9.7%. So that's nearly 1 in 10 student loan individuals are having to default on their loan or not being able to keep current with that. 1 in 10 is a fairly significant number. One thing to note is that number has actually been slowly coming down over the last 3 years. If you look at the chart, you see it kind of at a low part. It goes way up, kind of up high, then it comes down, then it comes back up, and then we're here kind of coming down. I think at the highest it was quite near 50%. Way back when, and we've really come down from there, and we're now down to 9.7% default loan rate. As I mentioned, under current laws, you can't have those removed in bankruptcy unless you go before a judge and you declare that they're deemed an undue hardship. This really doesn't happen a whole lot from what I was researching. And the big thing that's saying is this $1.7 trillion in debt, it can have, according to many of the arguments, a drastic effect on the economy. And that's really what they're arguing here is, one, they're predatory, that they're an undue hardship for many people, that and that they're very difficult to pay back. And what they've found is they're hard on the economy, that debt is that individuals with student loans are 11% less likely to start a business, was one of the stats I saw thrown around. So that's fewer businesses getting started up to help the economy. Another thing that you saw is among student loan borrowers, 43% have delayed home ownership due to their debt. I saw a few comments on there where people were talking about forgiveness. Yeah, if they forgave that, I'd be able to put that down payment, or I'd be able to buy a house for sure. And buying that house is one of the key things to building wealth for your average American. So what we are seeing here is home ownership rates are being affected by those long-standing student loans that people are having difficulty paying off. And then, of course, the argument is it's suppressing consumer spending, because if you had all that money back in your pocket, you'd be spending it and putting it into the economy. Another thing to note is, from the studies I did see, it does disproportionately affect minorities. So there are more minorities that are being impacted by these statistics. So that is one thing to keep in mind. So as we hear that, I think many people can see that is an issue. That's a very large amount of money, that $1.7 trillion. But some of the counter arguments that you'll hear is college grads make more money. They're the ones that should be paying it back. Why are we taking the money from everybody here in the case the taxpayer, to pay back these people that have an education that should be making more money. So I looked into that a little bit. Georgetown University did a study. They did find that on average, college graduates earn $1 million more over their lifetime. So they're earning significantly more on average. Another study that I saw, but this one was done by Pew Research, found that there was an income disparity or gap between high school and college graduates of about $17,500 a year. So again, that's quite a bit of extra money on average if you have that college degree that is going to be in your pocket. So what I would say is there's some truth to that, or there is a lot of truth to that. Those that have the college degrees do have a higher earnings potential. And I think what we are seeing is, as I pointed out earlier, a lot of those defaults on the loan are in that first 5 periods, where, and here we're talking about earnings over your lifetime, or so really it's being balanced out that they're earning later on in life, when after they're paying that back, or as they pay that back and get experience. Another thing that's interesting to note is they talk about all the student loan debt and that having a detriment to the economy. Looking into the counter arguments, one prevailing one I found was college graduates is also good for the economy. So having highly skilled labor in the U.S. is widely accepted as a good thing. It's a good thing for the economy. It provides skilled, knowledgeable workers and is a boost. So it's important, as we're talking about, there are downsides to the economy. There's also good things to the economy about these these highly educated workers coming into the workforce, making more money, and overall being more productive when it comes to America. Another interesting fact that I found as well, moving on, is you're also less likely to be unemployed. Apologize here. I'm trying to get this image to show. Well, for some reason it doesn't want to show. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can get it, but if not, that's fine. I'm why we're not showing. Interesting. Okay, well, for some reason it doesn't want to show. There it is. Here, I apologize for that little technical glitch here. But one thing that I wanted to point out is these unemployment levels by education. So unemployment for those that have less than high school on average is about 12%. As you move up higher education, you see a decrease in unemployment rate. So once you have an high school education, you're at about 9%. Once you have some college, it drops down to 6%. Associate's degree are down to 5% unemployment rates. And a bachelor's degree puts you down to nearly 3% unemployment, and graduate degrees move you into 2%. Now, all of this data is coming from the U.S. Census in 2016. It's a wee bit older, so if unemployment rates don't match up perfectly with what you're saying, just keep that in mind there. But so again, what we are seeing is we're really seeing that these college graduates that have this debt are more likely to make more money, and they're less likely to be unemployed, which is both good things. So there are definitely some benefits. So when you're talking about these are the individuals that on average should be making more money, they are having that. There is some truth to that statement. Another thing that I was looking at, because once we start talking about this and are these student loans too high, or the cost of tuition too high, things like that, what we got to start looking at is it really a return on investment? So you're sitting here, you're taking out a large loan, you're investing in yourself. Is it worth it? On average. And when I looked and I tried to find different stats for this, it's very difficult to measure the actual return on investment here. But for the most part, what I found is stats between 4% and 14%. So again, we're talking averages here. On average, these individuals that are going into debt are actually seeing a return on investment. So in the long run, on average, those that are straddled with the student debt are seeing a benefit from it. That's not saying it isn't a hardship. That's not saying that it's not a long period of hardship. And I'm not saying that it's not necessarily a predatory practice. But what I am seeing is that these are individuals that are more likely to pay it off. But what you're saying is these are averages, which means there are people that are affected differently. So this is not the case for everyone. The return on investment varies drastically when it comes to the college you attend, the degree program you do. Another thing that's interesting is these loan defaults are actually decreasing for the last 3 years, as I mentioned earlier. So when people talk about this student-led loan crisis, and they're talking about it, and often what they're indicating, and when they show charts like similar to what I did, where the total student loan debt is just going up and up and up, what you're also seeing currently, at least for the last several years, is you're seeing the default rate, or those that aren't able to pay that loan back, you're seeing it actually come down. So you might argue that it is a hardship, but I'm not seeing this becoming more and more difficult for people not to default on that loan. What I'm trying to say here in this counter argument is it seems to me like there is some merit into what some people are saying. These are people that are more likely to be able to pay this off. So it's a very interesting thing to note there. Moving on, the biggest thing that I see here is we're talking about the return on investment of the college. And I think that's what a lot of these analysis are missing. Some of them are bring this up and kind of touch around this, but the big thing we are talking about in this case is we should be talking about, are people getting value for this money? Or is this student loan money just giving them something that they can't pay back? And that's really the issue here. It's when you're straddled with this terrible debt, you can't get rid of it in bankruptcy, and it's not providing you a value, and you can't get out of that crushing debt. That's a terrible thing. And what we've found is or what I found in my research, I should say, is it really just depends on, again, that return on investment and if you're seeing it. One of the main concerns, or one of the concerns that around this area, I should say, are kind of twofold. And what I'm seeing is in a lot of these videos, people that are talking about paying off student loans or the student loan forgiveness, they really normally refer to two root causes for this issue. One big cause that you'll see is the increase in tuition. So it's fairly common knowledge here, and I brought this up on the screen if you're watching on YouTube. If not, I'll kind of walk you through the numbers. It's common knowledge. A lot of people talk about the drastic increase in college tuition and fees. When I was looking at these numbers, a lot of them just talked about costs of tuition only. But there are other fees, and we're talking about room and board here. And I found this nice chart. It's adjusted for inflation, so this is all in 2021 dollars. You'll see here the data starts here in 1963 to 64, and for a public 4-year university, what you're seeing is about $8,000 per year is what the tuitions and the fees total up to. And then you go here, it moves on to about 82, and after 82, it starts spiking quite a bit up, and it's moving up until, in this case, about 2015, 2016, it's over double what it started. So just in that short period there, a couple decades, we're now at $21,230 on average for tuition and fees, and then you see it move up here in 2020 to $21,400, just slightly. So there, and with the public 4-year, you're seeing quite a large increase. And what I found there is, well, we'll get into that in a second here. And then the steepest curve that you're seeing on this chart is for the private 4-year universities. So those already start off expensive here in that same 1963-64 period at $15,455 per year. And that kind of that goes up but levels out until 82 again, and then this is where you see it shoot up much higher than the public universities, and it moves on in 2010 to nearly $40,000, and in 2020, 2021 we're up to $46,448 for tuition, fees, room and board in 2021 dollars. So that's a very, very drastic increase, quite a bit over doubling of tuition. And this is really the big thing that people are talking about. There's what's going on here is this tuition has just gone through the roof. It's gone so high, and what this is requiring is for people to borrow larger amounts of money. And that's why you see on that chart the total student loan is just skyrocketing, and it's building and building until it hit that $1.7 trillion amount. So tuition, definitely a factor that we're talking about here. So the other cause or root cause that a lot of people seem to agree on, or at least the people that are arguing for the forgiveness, is one of the issues is what they call predatory colleges, or colleges that focus solely on enrollment and not necessarily results. Normally, what they're talking about is with the private for-profit universities. And what happens with these universities is they focus very highly on enrollment. They get lots of people there, and they focus on keeping them there, graduating there, but not necessarily providing an education that actually provides a value for the individual that got the degree. And you can clearly see that this is quite a bit of an issue when you look at those default rates on the loans that I was referring to earlier. So from the numbers I found, the default rate is 9.6% for public institutions. It's 6.6% for private not-for-profit institutions, and 15.2% for profit institutions. So that's that's very significant. It's a very high rate on average for the private for-profit institutions. Again, the whole goal of these institutions, these are the ones with the highest tuition rates on average, is to get people in. They're really trying to get people in, but they're not necessarily, it depends, you can look at their return on investment, but for a lot of them, they're not providing that value they need to. When 15% of the individuals can't pay their loans afterwards, your education may not be worth it. And what this means with this increasing costs of tuition is more and more college students are worried about if their school is providing value for them. Last I saw, or the survey I saw put it, that over 50% of college students were worried about if their education was actually a value for the money they. So with that, you can see these steep rises in tuition costs. I wanted to talk a little bit about that because there's a lot of debate on where that comes from. Because these steep costs in tuition, especially in public sector, or excuse me, I keep saying public. What I mean to say is the private for-profit sector. There's some argument about what's causing that, but I've seen several studies that I was able to find that either directly or indirectly linked the tuition rates to federal student aid program. Some of the studies were as much as 65 cents on the dollar. Now, this is hotly contested. There's different research on if that direct linkage between the availability of loaning money and the tuition rates applies across the board, including to public universities. But what I did see is there's a quite strong correlation for those private for-profit institutions. The theory here is when you give the students more access to money, in this case to loan, it allows these for-profit institutions to jack up their rates because the students can still borrow that money and still have access to the education, and it's not necessarily affecting their enrollment rate. So they're getting more money, the students have access to more money, and they're pulling it from that. I will say that that there is quite a bit of evidence that this applies to those private for-profit universities. And there are several studies that have shown a correlation even for public universities. Many people have compared this crisis to the housing bubble. What you've seen is what you see is the houses. Many people say the cause for that was the government stepping in and ensuring loans and making sure that individuals that may not have qualified before make sure that they have access to the money to buy houses. And more people bought houses, but not everyone could afford those houses. And what it ended up doing is driving up the costs or inflating the cost of houses, and eventually that bubble crashed. Many of us are familiar with this. I would say that's not a perfect analogy in this case, especially because the evidence is a little bit or a lot less for that theory applying to those public institutions. But what you can see here is the possibility that student funding is potentially one of the causes of the tuition rates. So again, two main causes that most people attribute to this to the crisis. One is the drastic increase in tuition costs and living costs. And second is those predatory colleges that are focusing on enrollment. Primarily what those are targeting is those for-profit institutions. So now that we've covered a little bit of the statistics, and by no means are these all the statistics, I'd encourage you to look into these more. Will student loan repayment or forgiveness, I should say, in this case, fix the issue? I'm having a hard time understanding how it fixed the actual underlying root cause of the issue. What I see is a standalone executive order to wipe the student debt, to me, does absolutely nothing to actually fix the root cause of this issue. So all you're going to do is pay off all of these loans, and what's going to happen is none of the underlying factors are any different. So in this case, we would spend that $1.5 trillion. Again, that's give or take. That's about what the federal student loan amount is. We would dump that money. That would very much likely go into the economy. We probably would see some students start to buy some of those that were in debt start to buy houses, potentially start businesses, perhaps 11% more businesses for those individuals. And so you might see some economic relief there. But if you don't fix that underlying cause, it's likely that this is just going to balloon up and happen again. And I think that's where a lot of people or a lot of conservatives or those on one side say, well, we haven't fixed the issue, or even some on both sides can say, if you don't fix the issue, we're just going to have to do this. Is this going to be something we do every 10 years? Is this something we're going to do every 20 years? Another proposal I'm seeing that we'll get into is that perhaps we'll just make college free for everybody. So the big negative of this just payoff is there is a big argument that this trigger inflation. Anytime you dump a lot of money into the economy or just print money, there is the risk of inflation. And again, we may further create into that bubble if you buy into that bubble theory here for this. So overall, I don't see this having bipartisan support. I don't really see it as fixing the issue. And I think even a lot of people that are for student loan forgiveness would also admit that they'd like to pair it with reform. And one of the other things that I see talked about is, well, let's just make college free and then do this. So everyone gets paid for college. And in my mind, that's also not fixing the underlying issue. The underlying issue here is that we have tuition rates skyrocketing, and we have colleges that are predatory, and they aren't providing a value for the dollar. And if we start just taking taxpayer money and making that free, all we're really doing is subsidizing those programs that aren't being run well, especially those for-profit colleges. So what would I like to see? Because I think we can all agree that this isn't a good thing. We don't want a lot of people straddled down in debt. We don't want a lot of people straddled down in debt where they can't get rid of it. We want those people opening businesses. We want people increasing their wealth by buying houses. So my opinion on this is insufficient on its own. I don't think it's a smart idea to just hand out the money and just move on. So perhaps you could win me over if you paired this with some reform. What would I like to see to actually address some of the root causes? One, I do think we need to crack down more on the predatory schools. I should say more than we do now. There is some there are some rules in place already. For instance, from what I saw, if I believe if your cohort or your default rate goes above 30%, you're no longer eligible for federal loans. So there is a cutoff there. You've seen this with some of the for-profit institutions. They've come under fire. There's been some threat of them losing accreditation, things like that. There are some tools to do that. I'd like to see a little bit more of that. The libertarian in me doesn't want to call for regulation here, but I absolutely understand that regulation might be necessary in this case. What I would really love to see, and I think this pressure should come from a lot of politicians, it should come mostly from students, from parents, everybody interested in college universities. I really think we need to start having more and more schools publish their graduation rates. You can normally find that information. I'd like to see their default rates. You can sometimes find that information, and their employment rates specifically for their degree program. That's one thing that, as I was looking for schools, as I was looking especially to move into my graduate program, I was very interested in finding. And I was amazed by how many schools did not do a simple thing as basically show the average or even some of the statistics about what kind of salary increases their students got. I would love to see some pressure for more and more schools to start including this. This was something that was very valuable when I was researching that, because you could look and you could see some of the statistics. You could see how likely were you. One of the graduate programs I was looking into was very, very well regarded. It had actually a lot of this information put on the site, but the cost of living in the area was really, really bad. It was a place where if I went there, I likely wouldn't be able to work full time and make good money, as well as attending the program, especially during the first year. And it was something that I saw I was going to have to get in a very, very large amount of debt to do. Looking at it, the rates or the benefits of their graduates was very good, so I had to make that trade-off. Is that a risk I am willing to take? Am I willing to take the risk of going $100,000 in debt or more for that type of benefit? In the end, for me, it was too much of a risk for me as an individual with a family. The primary person that works in the family just wasn't a risk I wanted to take. So I found another program. I found one that was a little bit more budget minded, something that I could work and do at the same time to really keep those costs low. But circling back, I really want to see that type of information on more and more schools. And I'd love to see that pressure come really from parents, from students, from a lot of that, is to start asking these schools, are you surveying this data? What is this data showing for you? And really do it, because if you're not doing it, it's hard to make that decision to do. Overall, there's also some more, in my opinion, root causes to this issue. Because what I'm seeing here is people either not asking for this information, or people not taking this information and actually making what I would consider a smart decision on whether or not it's worth it. So you see these predatory colleges that we talked about with their high default rates, degrees that often are seen as not providing the value that they need or value to individuals, and you're still seeing people falling into that enrollment trap and enrolling and kind of buying into that without any of the data. I will say you can go, and there are lists online of the ROI for many, many top schools. You can go there and you can find your school and see what the average ROI, but people either aren't doing this. So I think there's a big education component. I do think we need to teach our kids that they should be looking at the ROI of their colleges. We need to teach them that they should look at employment statistics. There are many things there are many resources where you can go on. I believe this, when I was in undergrad, this is something that was covered in undergrad. Early on, I believe it was, where they talked about going to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and when you're selecting career fields, it talked about the job outlook, about what kind of education was required and things like that. I'd love to see that incorporated into your children, either through schooling or through people as parents, teaching their kids to really look into that and to see that, one, not all degrees are equal. So some degrees may not have the same ROI, and you have to be okay with that. You have to understand that one, the total cost of your degree, including the housing and the different fees there, and just see, is that a risk you're willing to take, and can you pay it off? So in my mind, that's an important thing. And another thing that I'm seeing is, in my opinion, again, this is the opinion section of mine, is another root cause is society puts way too much value college education. Don't get me wrong, I highly value a college education. I think it's a good thing. I think it does help expand your knowledge. It helps introduce you to people from all kinds of different walks of life. It's a great learning and growing opportunity, and I think it's a good thing. And as I mentioned before, there are solid arguments for having a higher skilled workforce is great for the economy as well. But what I see is a lot of parents just push so hard that you have to go to college to you have to go to college. College is so important. And you see this in society. You see this in many of the jobs. They require that college degree, even though most likely a non-college graduate could do it just. And with this, I am seeing a little bit of change in society. I think they were talking about Elon Musk hiring individuals without college degrees, or starting to look more at the skills people have rather than what they have on paper. So I think some of that would fix that, is a little bit less pressure on individuals that they have to go to college, even if they don't know what they want to do, where they want to go. It's hard to make a good decision on the degree program you can do, and if it's worth it if you have no idea where you're going at the end. I'm not saying people shouldn't go to college, but what I am saying is they need to be able to make that decision. And there are many other ways that you can provide value to society and still make a good living. Trades are one that are very good. I mentioned before on this, I used to be a heavy equipment mechanic and welder. I believe I mentioned that before. I made good money doing that. It was hard on my body. It wasn't something that I wanted to continue doing, so I went to school. But that is something that I made good money doing, and it provided for me a path to where I could go to school. So again, I'm not saying that college educations aren't a good thing. What I am saying is I think we need some education, and perhaps society should shift a little bit to place a little bit less emphasis on it and not really drive people into. There's this drive that you have to go to college to be worth something. I think that's what's driving a lot of people into these predatory schools, because they're buying into that. I have to have this degree to be worthwhile. And they're really just doing whatever they can get in. So overall, my thoughts are, one, I would like to see for federal student dollars for schools to have to prove their value a little bit more. I'd like to have for them to show their statistics and that basically they're providing a good value for their education. I would really like to see that. And then what I want to see is, for those schools that aren't providing that good value, I want to see them suffer. I want to see those schools that aren't providing good value. I want people to go on there, realize they're not a good value, and not enroll in schools. I want that information to be available to them, and I want that feedback to get to the school. So that's kind of my opinion on that one. I really think that we should solve some of these issues here before we start handing out money that could cause inflation or paying taxpayer dollars into a really ineffective program. Once that I see a solid plan to fix these actual underlying root cause issues, in my mind, that's when I would be a little bit more open to look into some type of student loan forgiveness. And even then, if we're going to start the loan forgiveness or different things, or spend money on some of those social things, are college graduates the one we should be doing on? I don't know. I think there'd be some selection criteria we'd have to go to. Because again, we're giving money. In this case, Democrats are proposing we forgive $50,000 in student loans for every individual. And again, these are the individuals that over their lifetime are going to make $1 million more on average than a non-college graduate. I would like to see student loan I would like to see that be bankruptable, if that's a word. I would like to see that. People going through bankruptcy, they don't need that harsh burden of their student loan. In my mind, some of those things I think would be some of the solutions. And then I think we should encourage people and encourage those opportunities, some of those loan repayment programs where they could take where we could work with them a lot better and work on repaying those and forgiving some of it. So that's my overall opinion. I hope that you're able to see a little bit that there are two sides to this equation. When we talk about that comet where, have the power to remove a massive heartache from people, why wouldn't you do it? And the answer here, I hope, is a little bit clear that one, just that money, that $1.5 million of federal loan, one, yeah, it might help the economy a little bit, but it also could spur inflation. And two, it has to come from somewhere. It does. It has to come from somewhere. Either we're going to print more money, which again could spur inflation, or we're going to have to increase taxes. I think some of the proposals are talking about increasing taxes on the wealthy. That might be a topic for a different time, but we are going to have to take taxes to pay for people that really are, on average, getting a good return on their investment for those debts. So my mind is perhaps there's a better way to spend that money. Reasonable people, I think, could absolutely disagree on this issue. If there's something I neglected to consider, I would encourage you to leave a comment, or if you go to the Anchor site, there's a message button. Feel free to message me and be happy to discuss it a little bit, perhaps on the next podcast. So, moving right along, one of the other things that I wanted to cover was the Texas power outages. So these power outages, as many of you may know, there's a really big cold spell that's going out, and it's affecting many of kind of the central U.S. And most especially Texas. There are millions without power as we speak, and serious power infrastructure. And I saw kind of all around some claims here, or some different things that I thought were concerning, especially because I don't really want to politicize a disaster like this. There are people without power, without heat, and without transportation, without ways to get around. It's a terrible thing. This isn't just happening in Texas, but Texas has primarily been in the news. And then we see things like this. Let's see. I'm gonna go see if I can find this here. I believe this is image that I saw. This was posted on my Facebook feed. Many of you have probably seen this. This is not the first time that this has gone through. I think it was 2015, maybe 2016, when this variations of this went. You see here this caption: a helicopter running on fossil fuel spraying a chemical made from fossil fuels onto a wind turbine made with fossil fuels during an ice storm is awesome. There's some variations of that. And why this is coming back up again is many people, especially on the conservative side, are blaming wind power for the loss of power. And what they're saying is we've learned lessons from this renewable energy. Renewable energy is causing this, different things like that. So what I wanted to do is take a little bit of time and investigate some of those claims. So with that, I wanted to say, so some of the facts. Yes, some wind power was lost, and many sources, what I'm saying, and many of these fact checks, which we'll get into, are saying, yeah, but windmills were lost, but that's not the primary reason for this issue. And we'll get into that a little bit. About 23% of Texas energy is wind turbines. There was quite a bit of power lost all over. And one thing that's interesting is I was trying to pull some hard facts for this. And for all of these fact checks that I was finding, that we'll go over quite a few of them before, it was interesting and very hard to pull actual facts about this. So overall, what I found is if you look up wind turbines causing the Texas thing, you come up with all the fact checks and they say, no, it's not a cause. No, it's not a cause. And so let's go over some of that. And what they did do is these fact checking articles, many of them say this is the percent, or this is about how much of the power losses from wind, and this is how much from other sources, primarily natural gas. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of that. And I'm going to pull up one here. Oops, this is not the one I want. Definitely helps with the correct one. Give me 1 second here. I am missing some of mine. Where'd it go? Well, interesting. I thought I had all of these ready and good to go, but so moving on. Here we go. So here's one of the first ones that we see. So the state's grid operator, this is straight from a PolitiFact article. Again, one of these fact-checking articles, said on February 15th, about 34 gigawatts of power was offline, and only 4 gigawatts was due to problems with wind turbines. Check my math here, but I think that's about 12%, give or take rounded, of the problems are with wind turbines, according to this article. So great, absolutely, that sounds good. Now, some of these discrepancies in facts, but one thing I did want to mention is that February 15 link, we'll go over it later. Nowhere in there does it say that 4 gigawatts was due to problems with wind turbines, and I was unable to corroborate that fact. It was reported in several different articles. I have no idea where that came from, other than that link goes to the main company that runs the power in Texas, and it did not mention that number. So I can only assume they have pulled it from somewhere else, but I have absolutely no idea where. So moving on, another one. This one was from Fox. This was a little bit less of a fact check, Fox Business, I should say. But what this one said here is that the ERCOT, I'll say, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, that's the company that runs the majority of theirs, told the Austin American Statesman that about 12 megawatts of Texas wind generation capacity was hampered due to frozen wind turbines. And they did say that some of the unfrozen ones were spinning at a higher rate than expected. That claim, I saw that several times, where basically some of them were running better than expected. And again, I followed the link, and it just gave me that somebody said 12 megawatts. If you take that one, later on in the article, they put 30, that it was 12 of the 30 overall, which is about 40% of the power here in this case. So that one was interesting. That's Fox Business. That article, again, was a little bit less of a fact check and was focusing more on the turbines and just the actual facts behind that one. It was interesting. Not my favorite article. So moving on, there was CBS. So the CBS site here, again, this article here that says, "Don't blame wind turbines for Texas' historic power outages." So here we got going on. Here's what they're saying is 16 megawatts were from wind turbines. So here we're increasing up. Now again, these are different days, so it's quite likely these numbers could fluctuate. But we got 16 of 4,500. So I believe that is about 16% of overall energy. Oh, here we have 16% of it. Moving on to another one. This is the Texas Tribune. This one gives the same numbers, which is good because it's talking about that. I couldn't find those numbers, but it said 16 to 30. So again, we're talking about a fairly low percentage of it from winds. But then it moves on. But on Wednesday, 18 gigawatts out of 45 that were offline were from, in this case, it said renewable sources. So wind turbines and others. And we'll get into this. This is the only one that I was able to find on the actual company's website and find out what a little bit more about what this meant, and actually make sure or find the source for the fact for this fact check, I should say. Although they did not link the source or show the source, which to me isn't something that I like. I find it interesting that we have all these fact check articles. They have facts in it, but you have no way of double checking the facts, and they have different facts, and a lot of them that were linked just linked to other articles that said the same fact. So because another company said this, they're copying the other company who's copying the other company, and it's just something that I'd really, really love to see actual a way to corroborate it myself with the company or wherever it came from the survey, any of that information. You see that I try to do that a lot of times in this one, not always. But I'd really, really love to see that, especially when you're getting different numbers, and this is called a fact check. So overall, I found that a little bit disturbing and hard to do, because here what we're saying is 23% of Texas energy, from what I found, is from wind turbines this point of year. So if we go by the 4 gigawatt number, that's only 12%. In this case, what you're seeing is it's disproportionate. So in this case, what you're seeing is, a very small portion of this is from wind. And what all articles said is all articles said, no, it's not wind turbine, it's natural gas and other ones. Because natural gas is also, there's a shortage of natural gas. So a lot of the power plants aren't having the natural gas they need to generate the energy that is being demanded, all the excess energy. So that's only 12%. So you're hearing say, oh, okay, so that's a pretty small percentage of the wind energy that's being affected in theory. But then you go to the other one that's 12 gigawatts of 30, and that's 40%. Well, if only 23% of Texas' energy is from wind, and 40% of the losses is from wind, I think that's a big problem. Now, you can still make the claim that most of them were from gases, but what you can also say is, in this case, or you can say is, perhaps wind energy isn't as good in that situation, because the vast majority of the power that's lost is from, not the vast majority, but a higher percentage of it it's disproportionately from the wind energy, I should say. So that was interesting. But then again, we go to 16 gigawatts, which is 16%, which is more in line with what you'd expect if it's, even issues across the line, as lots of people were talking, or a lot more gas. And then again, that last figure was 18, which turned out to be almost 40%, which again, that's more than you'd expect if wind energy wasn't to blame at all. So what I wanted to do here is, what does the company say? What's the actual company in charge of this saying is the issue? And especially since a lot of these were citing that this is what they were saying. So let's go ahead and get into that here. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the company announcements. So here are the actual company announcements. This is one of them that was linked to. This is the majority of the announcement. There was a little bit before it, but here it says, we are dealing with higher than normal generation outages due to frozen wind turbines and limited natural gas availability. So the first thing they list there is wind turbines and natural gas. They are saying that there are frozen wind turbines. So when you see all these fact checks, no, it's not frozen wind turbines. Okay, well, the company's saying that. Now, you can still say that the majority of the power lost is from the other ones, but okay. Interesting. Moving on. Again, I wasn't able to find, even though this was linked in one of them as the source, I wasn't able to find exactly what percentage of that was from wind energy. So I'm going to have to assume those numbers I pulled were correct, that came from the article. Moving on, here's another one the next day that they said. Again, they're saying, hey, we restored some of the lost power. So what's the reason for it? While the grid operators were already contending with frozen wind turbines and limited gas supplies, additional units were tripped offline and the weather worsened overnight. So again, we're seeing this. They're saying, and wind turbines were a significant factor in this. So, okay, all right. If wind turbines were significant factors, let's look at the next day. Now, they didn't have a public press release on the 16th, so I have to go from here. And again, they're talking about more. Some factors include frozen wind turbines. This is the largest day. This is 46 megawatts of energy was missing, or not missing. It was an outage of that. So some of the factors include frozen wind turbines, limited gas supplies, low gas pressure, and frozen instrumentation. So here they list wind turbines. Again, one of the top ones. I hope what you're seeing here is, according to their information, they are listing wind turbines first. So it might be reasonable to assume that, okay, this is a significant factor. Perhaps some people didn't, with again the information they're given here, they know almost nothing about the percentage in the other press ones here. So here you're seeing that going on. So moving on, in this one, you will notice at the bottom, there was some numbers here. So this is the one of the 46 megawatts, or gigawatts, I should say, 46 gigawatts for stop the event, 28 megawatts, or 28 gigawatts, excuse me, is thermal, and 18 gigawatts is wind and solar. So here we can see that that high number, in this case, again, this is the last day that they had the information available. So some of those articles may not have this information available at the time. But here you're seeing the confirmation that it is 18 out of 46. So again, that's running right at about 40% of the outages from their power system are coming from wind. That's a very significant thing. Now again, they said earlier in the article, it's not only wind, but it's also these other things. So a small portion of their power supply, in this case, I think it said 23% or so. I actually think the number's 22.9, but 23% of their expected power, for nearly 40% of their losses is coming from that. So that's high. So what I'm saying here is I do think perhaps that the wind turbines are an issue. Taking them at their word, perhaps it is. And you'll see here that is the number for the latest day. So a disproportionate amount of the energy losses came from that. Now what you might say here is if you're a smart individual, is you'll say, well, that said it's wind and solar. So that's probably throwing off the numbers. And yeah, you're correct. That's a good observation. I'm glad you pointed that out. So what I wanted to do is look and see, well, how much of that is solar? Is that affecting a lot of it? Well, here's how much of Texas's power comes from solar. 1.76%. So really not much, less than 2%. So what I can assume here is that 18 gigawatt number, very little of that is probably coming from solar, especially because they didn't even list it in their major lists of cause that I talked about earlier. So overall, what I'm trying to say here is those fact checkers, the way they answered it is technically true. The fact checkers said the majority of it isn't. But what they also said is, don't blame the wind turbines. Well, in this case, wind turbines disproportionately were one of the cause. Again, they're supposed to be 23% power, but they're causing about 40% of the outages, according to the information submitted from the actual power company. So I would encourage you to go in to actually look and try to find some of these numbers, and you'll see here that these fact checkers, while technically correct, are perhaps have an agenda because they're trying to protect this wind. Again, I do want to point out or caveat some of this to say the largest numbers that I was able to, or that I just showed you, are from the latest number, and that's after some of those articles were released. But every single time the electric company mentioned that wind turbines having issues were one of the things. Now what you might say is, well, that means renewable energy and wind energy is trash, or we shouldn't use that. And I'm seeing a lot of conservatives say that and use this as a time to diss on renewable energy or wind energy. And that's not what I'm saying here. What I want to say is, I don't think either side is right. What I want to say is, wind energy or renewable energy does have some downsides, and that's okay. It's okay for different power options to have some pros and some cons. Wind energy has some cons. You have to wait for the wind to actually be blowing. It's not consistent. And another one here is, if not properly insulated or properly protected, it can be susceptible to cold weather. And that's one of the big things here that you see talked about is, yeah, they're freezing up or they're having issues, but there are wind turbines in other areas that more frequently get cold stuff that heating elements and ways to protect from them. In this case, this is just unheard of temperatures for Texas, so they didn't pay for protection. If you never or almost never have temperatures this low, Why would you pay millions and millions of dollars to protect all your wind turbines from temperatures this low? I say millions, I have no idea how much it costs, but I imagine it's quite a bit. So what they're saying is they didn't foresee this issue, or they saw it as a very minor risk, and that risk occurred. And that is something that happens. When you talk about business and evaluating risks, you look at risks such as this. So you look at the risk of this temperature being way crazy and it goes way below. And you look at the costs of doing this, and you see, is it worth it versus not buying it? In this case, they probably saw that it costs a very significant amount of money to upgrade it, and the risks of this temperature causing this issue was almost nothing, or very small, I should say. So what I'm saying is not that wind energy is bad or renewable energy is bad. So if you're jumping on that one and trying to take that takeaway from me, I would say, hold on. There are good things about wind energy. There are good things about renewable energy. When we go back and we talk about that helicopter meme, at the top, don't get your news from memes. I hope you all understand that. One, that from what I could tell, that picture, or from my research, that picture was taken a long time ago when they were doing some experiments on windmills, and it has nothing to do with how they prevent windmills from freezing now. That's instead they use what I talked about before, basically like a carbon fiber and some heating elements and different ways to protect it, so they're not using that type of thing. And a meme like that gives you absolutely no facts. It doesn't say, oh, it says it's interesting that the fuel is used from here, and this fuel and this fuel and this fuel, but it doesn't say, hey, how much is that windmill saving? Is it comparable? Are we actually using more than not? None of those facts are in the meme. So again, don't get your news from memes. Try not to get your impressions from memes. Look them up, and you'll see that that meme, or that kind of sentiment that's in that one, has been debunked multiple times. But again, also when you're looking at things and you're seeing some of these fact checks, sometimes it pays to fact check the fact checkers. People can have biases, and in this case, it appears to me that they jumped very, very heavily to try to save the reputation of wind energy, and try to make it all about, oh, well, it's the majority of natural gas. And while that's true, technically they didn't lie. I do think what we're seeing here is there are cases where wind energy isn't perfect. There are cases such as here where a lot of an unexpected freeze come, you weren't prepared for it, you didn't pay for the ultimate package, the weatherization package, we could say, because you didn't expect to need it, and it might go down, and you may need to prepare for that. So in this case, in the contingency plan, there could have been a lot of things that was done. I believe that Texas thought that they could withstand something like this. One thing in my searches, or some of this information taken from those same fact-checking articles, one of the things that they were talking about frequently was that Texas doesn't keep a lot of reserve for their natural gas refineries. So what they know is they have a ton of it. They can easily get it. So what they do is they don't keep a ton in reserve. And what happened here is all the coldness slowed down their ability to extract that natural gas, which affected their supply to their power station. And because they didn't have a lot in reserve, that's affecting a lot of that natural gas, in addition to some of the instruments freezing and things. Whereas other states don't have that abundant and ready on hand source of natural gas, so they stock up a lot more, or they have a stock to prepare for this. Overall, what I think the takeaway from this is, yeah, sometimes natural energy does have some downsides, or renewable energy may have some downsides, and that's okay. The important thing is, are the downsides worse than the upsides? In this case, renewable energy, there are some upsides to it. Don't just jump to conclusion, because in this case, they had issues. There was also issues with natural gas. There are also reported issues with nuclear. There are issues with every other type of energy. There are pros and cons to each one, and not all of them withstood this cold snap. So I hope you really enjoyed kind of that analysis or the breakdown, especially that kind of fact checking, the fact checkers. I do encourage people, when you see things, dig into those numbers. If somebody claims something, see where the sources are coming from. One thing to watch out for is these fact checkers or these websites that quote websites that quote websites that quote other websites, and you can never find the actual numbers. That concerns me, and in my mind, that's a bit of lazy journalism. That's something that I was doing some research for a project, a graduate project once, and I kept coming on this great number that really fit my case, and it's the case I wanted. And me and some other team members, we dug into that number, and we dug into it, and we tried to find the origin of that number, even though it was repeated absolutely everywhere as fact. We never found the source of that number or that percentage. I believe the number was some obscene amount of money that was wasted in ineffective means. If you Google it, I'm sure you'll find it. And we couldn't find it. I think eventually someone traced it back to, it was in a random book where the person claimed it and also didn't cite where that came from. So it was somebody said it in a book, and we could never find out where it came. So I would just encourage you, when you're looking at news sources, even main ones, to have a skeptical mind and try to track it down yourself. Try to see where information is coming from, especially when you're seeing different numbers. In this case, I think likely these numbers were correct. Likely the numbers were just perhaps they reached out to the spokesman and they got those numbers for the day from them. Just say, hey, according to them, and in the one case linked to an article that didn't even have those numbers. If that's the case, say it. Tell me where you got it. Say I contacted the spokesman or something like that. I really would encourage people to be skeptical of some of the news articles. Watch out for that. And again, don't jump on the memes. Look into them. If it sounds a little bit crazy, or if things just don't make sense, one of the versions of that meme is, like something about like common sense isn't common or something like that. If you see something that doesn't make sense, look into it. Overall, that's my episode for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, feel free to comment. Feel free to go to the Anchor podcast site and use the message button there to send me a message. Let me know what you want to do. There are plenty of other topics that I plan on covering. Some other things that I'll likely be covering in the future are topics such as immigration, looking at both sides of that issue. I did a little research already before this, thinking that I was might cover some now, and boy, did I find some interesting stuff where both sides kind of use their own terminology and try to manipulate studies and different things to prove their point and to prove that they're right. So it was a quite interesting dipping of my toes into that one. I will say that'll take me some time to unravel, but I do hope to get to that in the future, and I suspect I likely will. But thank you, everyone. See you next week.